Hi, welcome to GatsbyCamp 2021. I'm Grayson Hicks, and this is 4 real-world solutions with Gatsby Functions. I worked on this presentation with Greg Hardy, who's a fellow senior software engineer on the customer success team here at Gatsby. This is based on a project that we built for an internal Gatsby exercise where we wanted to all get acquainted with Gatsby Functions and some real-world use cases for Gatsby Functions. So let's dig into the agenda. We're going to look at an intro to functions themselves. Then we're going to do some auth, some server-side APIs, computations that are too heavy for the client side, and sending an email with Gatsby Functions. Before we get into all that, let's just look at the app that's built underneath all of this. It is called Pup Snuggles. It is a lighthearted app that lets you schedule and pay for time with the dog near you. If you want some time to snuggle with the dog, you can search, filter by breed, location, etc., and then you can book and pay for a snuggle session with that dog. We do allow with a single sign-on with Google, so we can sign into the app here. It's saving our information. It pulls up a list of all the dogs that can then be filtered, via zip code. You can filter by breed. You can search. You can then select the dog. This will bring up the striped checkout, which will let us pay for the time with the dog. We've put our dummy information here with the striped checkout, so we're going to pay for that. This will then send us to the Calendly API, which has a number of available sessions for the dog, and we can schedule those sessions. As we do that, you can see that I've received the email confirming that someone has paid $50 for a session with the dog. We're going to book our time and confirm and schedule. And that's it. That's the basics of the app. So now let's dig into some of those steps to see how we built those with Gatsby Functions. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the project. Now let's look at how we turned functions on and get a little intro of how the Functions API works. I really like how one of the developers here at Gatsby described Gatsby Functions, and he described it as a natural extension of Gatsby. It feels very natural. Where normally you would reach for another service provider to use a serverless function, here you're just going to be reaching inside Gatsby's API itself. The first thing you're going to want to do is enable the functions flag. It's still technically beta, so you need to tell Gatsby that you're going to want to be using functions. To do that, you go inside the Gatsby config, you set functions equal to true, and then you'll restart your development server. The next thing about functions is that it uses file system based configuration. So it's going to be looking for a specific directory for where your serverless functions are. That directory is under the source directory and API. Inside API, you're going to create a TypeScript or JavaScript file that controls each function. We're going to do a really simple example first before we get into the examples that we used in the project. So we're going to create a file called time.js. And to tell Gatsby which function we're going to be using inside this file, it's going to be whatever the export default is. So you may have other functions inside this file that help you determine the response or compute something like that. But whatever the export default is what will get called. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this function in here. It's a simple function from the docs. And it's going to receive the request and the response object. These objects are the native Node HTTP request and response objects, but they have a little bit of added, Gatsby extras on top, which we'll get into later. But we're going to get those. We're going to return our response that is an object with the current date in it, right? So we've got this saved. Our development server is already running in the background. It will have restarted. Now we're going to go to our local host here, and we want to test this in development. So to do that, we're going to go to /API/time. And there we can see the JSON object response put in here. And if I keep refreshing the page, I'm going to see that the time is updated. So that's the basics of turning functions on, how the functions work. There's some other cool things that you might want to look at the docs here. It's under how to and functions, getting started. Goes through some of the stuff I went to. You can have dynamic routing for your functions. shows your TypeScript types, digs into some other things. So be sure to check those out as well. Now let's start looking at the actual app, and we're going to start out with our auth function and see how we can log in with Google using Gatsby Functions. I don't know about you, but as someone that's been using Gatsby for a long time, auth has always been one of those situations that made me feel like I needed to reach for something outside of Gatsby. So to me, this is one of the most exciting use cases for Gatsby Functions, is being able to authenticate on the back end without necessarily needing another server standing up somewhere else, or needing to use serverless functions through another service. So let's dig in. In this case, we are using OAuth with Google. You may be using some other provider. It doesn't really matter. So let's get started by importing the whatever library you're going to be using. We're using Google. The next thing you're going to need possibly is some environment variables. So one great thing about functions is you can reach into your environment variables just like you can on the Gatsby front end. So we've got those, and then you're going to follow whatever process for initializing the client. So I'm going to be initializing the Google OAuth client here, passing in the ID, the secret, and in this case, this is important for our app, I'm going to be passing in the redirect URL because there's going to be one more step we need to do after authenticating on the back end. In that case, is going to be our Google Access Token function. You can see the API route here to this lets us know, hey, we're going to be hitting another Gatsby function after we redirect. Then let's set these options into place. We're going to define some more just kind of like Google specific options with our, what do we need from the user? What kind of authentication are we doing? And all of this is just setting up for the actual Gatsby function. If you notice, I haven't done a default export here. So if I were to run this, it would not work. Gatsby would say, I don't see an exported function. Don't know what you want me to do. So let's start with our export default. And remember, it's an anonymous function that gets the request and response objects. And now we're going to generate the callback URL for our OAuth. Right, so we're going to actually call the OAuth client, get the generated auth URL, pass in our scopes that we set before, and now we're going to need to do our successful redirect with that authorized URL. So we have the redirect method on the response object, so we're going to call that and pass in our authorized URL. One thing that's important to note that's happening with this authorized URL is when this gets returned, it's going to have this code query param appended to it, so that when we get to this redirect URI URL with the Google Access Token function, we're going to be able to grab that code off of the request object. Cool. So we have our redirect about to happen where we're going to be sent to the next serverless function, right? Google has authenticated us and it's now sent us a code that we can use to persist that authentication later on. So this function is going to start out very similar to the login function. We're going to need our Google library set up. So we're going to do all this just the same as we did in the login function. We're going to get our environment variables. So we're going to initialize the client. We're going to pass in the options. And now it's time to do our next function. So this function here, we're going to get our request in. And now this request, remember, is coming from the login function that we just wrote. And this is where you start to see one of the first kind of Gatsby aspects to these request and response objects. And what Gatsby does is we normalize the query params for you. So instead of having to parse out query strings, it's already an object for you, and you can just grab the value that you're trying to get. In this case, it's code that was appended by the Google API. So we have our code. We then need our client to get the token using that code. We call that, and then that token is going to be set as a query param for our auth redirect. So one aspect that's different here from our login function is we have a different redirect URI here than the one that gets passed into the Google client. So this one is where we're going to get sent afterwards. In our case, it's this auth redirect page. So the auth redirect page is going to get a token param that's going to be our token from the OAuth client. So the app redirect here, this is the auth redirect route is a client-side route. So once we get inside this file, we're going to kind of leave the Gatsby Functions demo, and this is where you'll have to use, your judgment with your app of how would you persist this login. You might use local storage, you might use a context provider, you might use a cookie, you might use any different thing. But after this, the function has kind of served its purpose, and then you're back into React and how you handle a client-side authentication in React. So in our case, we're using a really simple method, not something you would use in production because we're not actually reading any values from the profile. We're not reasserting later on that someone is logged in. We're setting it into local storage and then redirecting you to the home page. You'd want to follow whatever pattern you normally follow for checking authentication throughout a client-side app. So this is one of the most exciting, this is one of the most common useful patterns for using Gatsby Functions. Now let's get into the next one. So we've completed our auth. And auth is one of those things that needs to take place on the server side, but there's a lot of other APIs that may need to take place on the server side. They might need to generate some kind of token. You might need to create a session. You want to avoid certain CORS limitations, things like that. So let's look at our Stripe implementation and how we were able to interact with the Stripe API using a Gatsby function. App-wise, we've logged in here. We want to snuggle the dog, right? So when we click this, it's going to run a function. Notice we got redirected here to checkout.stripe, but there's a lot of stuff that happened in between there. So let's look at what happens when we're clicking that snuggle button on the Gatsby side. This is the function that actually gets called. It's exported in a util file here, but when you click on the button, this is what happens. This function has a couple parts to it, and the only part that interacts and touches Gatsby Functions is this initial fetch and post right here. So this post is going to send some information on the dog. This event type we'll come back to later when we look at the email. But it's going to hit the API purchase session function, and then it's going to return that response, and then we will see the redirect happen that we just saw happen in the browser. But in order for that to happen, it needs the session ID that happens on the server side. So this is the aspect that wouldn't work without a serverless function or a server out there to generate the session ID for us. So let's build this purchase session function. As with the other ones, we're going to need our library. So we're going to import our Stripe library. Again, we're going to interact with our environment variables right here. We're going to export our default function with our async function, with our request and response. And here we're going to get the information from the dog off of the initial request. So we're going to need this later for our confirmation page, as well as the name of the dog. And next is where we're going to actually create the Stripe session. So this Stripe API is the server-side version versus in the util function. This is happening on the client-side version of the Stripe API. So here's where we're going to create our session. And there's a bunch of options in here that aren't necessarily important. But we're going to set the price and quantity for the dog snuggle session. And then what is important is we're going to set our redirect URL. So this is going to be a client-side route to our confirmation page with the dog's name and some other information about the dog. For these functions to work, you need to make sure that you're returning the response, not just doing the logic inside the function. You need to return the response here. And as you can see, we're sending the session ID that's returned from the Stripe API. So that's really it for interacting with any kind of server-side API with Gatsby Functions. in this case, it's going to then take us to the checkout. And then after you go through the checkout, you would go through the success URL, which is a client-side route. So you'd have your confirmation page, and you would do whatever logic and UI that you need to do there. And so the coolest thing about this is it's not necessarily super complex or anything like that, but it is something that would normally take part outside of Gatsby and be like an additional part of your infrastructure. And now it's something that can take part within Gatsby, and you can continue to build your app very seamlessly. Now let's have a look at another cool use case where it's just something that's too heavy, too expensive to take place on the client side. So this one's really fun because this one came up organically as we were building the app, because we were doing some filtering that was too expensive to take place on the client side, and it was literally crashing the browser. And luckily, it just felt so nice and easy to reach for a Gatsby function here and solve the problem. So let's look at what we were trying to do and how this came to be. So this is our search page, and one of the things that we wanted to be able to do was filter it by location. And just as part of the UX, we wanted an autocomplete of the zip code. So this component itself is a great little component from Reach UI called Combo Box, and this Combo Box offers a list of predetermined elements. In our case, it was every United States zip code, which is about 41,000 zip codes. The component offers a way to search those on the client side, and it also offers a way to search those on the server side. When we first started out, we used the client side search, and every time the browser would crash because filtering and matching against 41,000 zip codes was too much for the browser to handle. So then we moved over to the server side search and created a Gatsby function that would handle this. So I want to skip over some of the React loading states and things like that, and just focus on the actual Gatsby function itself. So the combo box has an onChange handler that we're calling here, and this handle zip change is going to eventually call this set zip. Set zip is going to have a use effect that lets us call this search zip function. So just said a lot of things there, but eventually it all leads back to this search zips function, which hits our actual Gatsby function. So this is at API/zip code, and it has a query param getting passed in that is the search value. So we do a couple things to optimize. It doesn't search until there's 3 characters, but then it passes those characters on to the Gatsby function. So if we pull up the actual zip code function here, it's incredibly slim. We get the zip code itself here, and we're importing all 41,000 zip codes as an array here, and then returning the ones that match. So as far as the user is concerned, when you search, when you type in up to 3 characters, you can see this list of matches that's returned from the Gatsby function, and then as it filters down, you get your actual zip code. So to me, that felt like a really great example of something that was made a lot simpler, and we were able to solve a problem that was unexpected using a Gatsby function. Same amount of code as we would have had if we were doing this client side, but just by moving it into source API zip code and then adding the fetch in there, we're able to solve this problem. So really a fun one. Another instance of this may be like some kind of charting libraries, anything where you're going to have lots and lots of data that might be difficult for the browser to handle. If I were trying to order these functions in terms of the popularity or the most common use cases, sending an email might be up towards the top, but I wanted to order these more in the structure of how the app actually worked. So the email in this case is generated when you're checking out. So when someone actually purchases or confirms time with the dog, then we're going to send an email to the account owner, the small business owner that would say, hey, someone has scheduled time with this dog, and here's the information. So an interesting part about this is it's going to interact with another Gatsby function, but in this case, it's interacting outside of Gatsby. And what I mean is when we do our purchase session, that interacts with the Stripe API. And the Stripe API has a UI in their dashboard where you can set up webhooks. So what we have set up is a webhook that when a purchase of a certain type is made, it makes a post to an endpoint. And in this case, we've set up another function, and we've told Stripe for that webhook configuration, this is the endpoint we want you to hit, and that endpoint is a Gatsby function. So we put it at /API/Stripe webhooks. So we're going to need some information from the Stripe webhook, and it's going to send it along. We're going to be sending this email with SendGrid, so we're going to get this configured with our environment variables. We've got SendGrid set up, and now, of course, we need to set up our top-level Gatsby function. Now, inside here, in other cases, we have read from the query params or something that we have set. In this case, it's being set by the Stripe API. So we're reading the charge amount from the Stripe webhook. This is not something that we've set up in a Gatsby function or anything like that. This is just being posted to us by the Stripe API. Next, we're going to need to build the configuration for the email message itself. So this is based on SendGrid's API. We're going to do our to, from, subject, the actual body of the email itself, and put our charge amount in there as well. So this charge amount is kind of like the touch point between the Stripe API and this email API. Then we're going to use SendGrid to actually send the email. And one aspect here that we haven't talked about is logging. So we're going to send the email, and then we're going to log email sent, or we can log an error. I think we were doing this in some of the other functions as well. I didn't point it out, but these logs would show up in Gatsby Cloud if you're using Gatsby Cloud, or in whatever terminal you might be running locally with the Gatsby process. This is where you would see those logs. And the last thing is we need to remember to return a response. So we're just going to return, a response with a status code 200 to say, hey, this is successful. So this is how you would send an email with Gatsby. It's kind of got the added layer of reading the price from the Stripe API, and in a sense being triggered by this purchase session, because this is a Gatsby function that triggers the Stripe webhook that then triggers this endpoint to be called, which is another Gatsby function. So it's a really cool kind of cycle here, and Gatsby is really at the center of that. So from here, you could use your imagination however you wanted to include email functionality in your app. You can see how to implement that with Gatsby functions. I really hope you enjoyed those 4 real-world examples of using Gatsby functions to solve problems. Greg and I are here for Q&A, any questions you might have. Shout out to Team Blazing here at Gatsby that helped build this application. And we're really, really excited about functions. And so hopefully this is useful for you, and really excited to see what you build with functions. Thanks for coming to Gatsby Camp.